It is with incredible pleasure that we welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Thank you so much for this incredible opportunity to speak to you about Coming Home, the Church of England's report on tackling the housing crisis, launched this week. It was commissioned in 2019 by yourself and the Archbishop of York. The commission is independent of the Church of England's institutions with complete freedom to say whatever it thinks and believes is necessary. And this report is certainly that. It is an extraordinary piece of work put together by the commissioners, led by Charlie Arbuthnot, who was the former funding advisor to housing associations. It takes, frankly and honestly, the housing issue, the housing crisis by the horns, and addresses the poverty in our society and major issues, difficult issues like land ownership, which of course is directly relevant to the church. Now, before I turn to the questions, I have two quick thank yous to make. The first is to your excellent team at Lambeth Palace, who have been so helpful, and that includes Chris Cox, Abby Martin, and Julianne Broughton-Noble. The second is to the man who made this all possible. Martin Kingston is someone who everybody watching will know, but Justin may not. Martin was for much of his career one of the most preeminent planning silks in the country, a very committed Christian, and someone who in retirement is working just as hard now for the church. Without further ado, I'm going to move to the first question. And my question is simply to ask, what led you to set up the commission?
Thank you very much. And thank you to you all for inviting me to do this. One of the things about the Church of England is we've got more branches than any other institution in England. I think NatWest and people like that have about 2,500, 3,000, or Tesco, and we have 19,000 or 15,000, somewhere around there, most of which were built more than 700 years ago, fair enough, but they're there. We're in every community. And I was a vicar for 10 years, and one of the characteristics of being in a local parish, just as the local vicar, is that you see the problems. And the biggest problem that those on, certainly in the urban areas, the kind of places I've worked some of my time, and the outer estates, brought forward was the issue of availability and affordability of housing. And I was writing a book about 3 years ago. It's a very boring book called Reimagining Britain. And one of the bits of when I was writing on housing in that, one of the things that came across was that we needed to talk more about communities and less about housing. And after it had gone out, in order to try and redeem the boredom of it, someone suggested we did a commission on housing to try and pick up what our people around the country were saying. And they did. We have land. We have to think hard how to use it well. We really care about people. We deal with the fallout. We see the injustice. And at the heart of the Bible and of Christian teaching are great images of coming home. I mean, one of the best known stories of the prodigal son, you know, when he's the younger brother's gone away, he's far away, he's in a time of famine, and he says, what am I doing here? I'm going to go home to my father. The idea of home has a resonance at the depth of who we are and what we are. So all those things came together.
Can I ask, Justin, the question about how do we get, in the light of your report, how do we get the government to take the provision of housing, and particularly those who need assistance, how can we get them to take it seriously?
Well, I think the report is very clear about the nature of the crisis, which you would know, I'm sure, with your jobs better than I do. 8 million people in substandard homes, more children in substandard housing now than there were when Ken Loach produced Cathy Come Home in the mid-60s, which had a dramatic impact. 3.5 3 million houses built over the last 20, 25 years, and 2.5 million people more renting than used to. And you could go on, that it is a huge number of people who spend more than a third of their income on housing. It is going to be, it's not the government doesn't take it seriously, but I think we have a series of opportunities and crises at this moment in our country. The pandemic stripped the wallpaper and showed us the cracks in the plasterwork. We've got a generation of children at school who've had their education severely disrupted, and that's on the news in a big way today. We've got the economy having fallen more last year than any year since 1708. We've got the health service where, I mean, I go in to St. Thomas's Hospital as a volunteer assistant chaplain, and the biggest thing you see is the exhaustion level of the staff is beyond anything you can imagine. They look, at the end of a shift, they look like troops coming out of the trenches in the Great War, just absolutely ashen with tiredness and the stress of the last 12 months. And we've seen this incredible injustice in the way the pandemic, the virus has killed people. And a lot of that links to housing. Multi-generational, overcrowded, substandard housing. There are many other reasons. This crisis goes back 40 years. I'm not blaming this particular government. When we look at that, I think we have a portfolio of needs that we can bring out really powerfully to government and to landowners and to property owners and to the church and to developers and to people like yourselves, where we can have a collective view that says this has got to change. It's a solvable problem. And moreover, it's a solvable problem which is good for the economy. When you want to get an economy going, you build houses. You know, it gives you basic jobs. You've got apprenticeships, you buy carpets, you get white goods, all the stuff. So this is a win-win to get the economy going, train the people who've lost out, get us some really skilled, newly trained young workers at the beginning of their careers, and at the same time transform our society and above all our communities. Apart from that, it's all downside.
Can I just ask Justin, I'm struck by a number of points in the report, but one of which is that this is the church putting its money where its mouth is, or rather its land where its mouth is, which is really quite startling. To what extent is this deliverable with or without government's assistance, or is this deliverable in terms of the church's aspirations? Do you need government buy-in for this?
That's a very, very good question, Paul. The implication of your question is that it makes change to see the church putting its land where its mouth is rather than its foot where its mouth is. I think
that was the implication.
I think you're right. It's a big challenge. The church can certainly do this and ought to do this. In one sense, the Archbishop of York, in something we did this morning, ended quite rightly with Stephen Cottrell, with something we've been saying to each other, is what this very independent and challenging report does is to say to us, where is the church's soul? You know, sorry to keep mentioning religion, but it's kind of my job, like yours is law. And there's one of the parables, or there's one of the things Jesus said is, your heart will be where your treasure is. And if your treasure's in heaven, your heart will be in heaven. If your treasure's in the bank, your heart will be with your money. And the church has a lot of land. We don't know exactly how much, we're mapping it, but the church commissioners alone have just short of 100,000 acres. We're one of the country's biggest landowners. Some of that, 6,000 acres of the Church Commissioner's land, is strategic land with planning potential or actual planning permission. The land we have with the dioceses, with the parishes, with the trusts and the charities is enough to be catalytic in changing this, to really catalyse a major change. But it won't lead to permanent impact unless across government there is a common vision of what housing should be, and that government comes in and everyone involved in development and building comes in. So it's got to be wide, very wide. I mean, the report starts with setting out a theological vision of good housing, but it does it in very accessible ways. And it comes up with 5 words beginning with S, which you probably see, that housing should be sustainable, environmentally friendly. It should be safe, not just from outsiders, but not like Grenfell, in other words. It should be good quality safety. It should be stable. People should know that they can put their roots down. So many people in rented accommodation move every year. I know from my own childhood how disruptive that is. It should be sociable. It should have green space and parks, but it should also be big enough that people, your neighbours can drop round for a cuppa. You can put your feet up and chat with other people. You build your networks. And it should be satisfying. It should be beautiful. It should be something that you get in, you sit down, you say, I'm home, with all that lovely feeling of being home is. And to do that, there's 2 other S's, or 3, in fact, though they only picked 2. There must be a strategy. So we've got to look at 20, 30 years cross-party and say, this is what beautiful housing looks like. This is what we want to have as our housing, things that meet these criteria. And it must have clear metrics for what's going to be achieved over that time so they can work backwards. And to do that will be sacrificial. So that's my 6th S. And it must be strategic. That's my 7th S. But my 8th one is an hopeful one. It is solvable. We can do this. This is not, there are some problems people have been tackling for a century and we're not, that will always be with us. This one need not be with us.
Thank you.
So I think it's exciting.
Justin, you've sort of answered a bit of my question, because my question was to ask you this really. COVID-19 and Grenfell have both served to illustrate the inequalities in housing. And I was interested in the fact that governments get elected every 5 years, and yet you have announced this 20-year political programme to improve the quality and affordability of the nation's stock. And so I was interested in why 20 years? Is that because, for example, you're trying to transcend party politics, or is it perhaps just a reflection of the size of the task?
It's both. It must be non-party political. Can any one of you remember what the key point of the National Health Service is? What their vision is?
Free service.
The point of delivery.
Yeah.
What's the equivalent for housing? There isn't one. That's the point. Health, housing, education. Those are the 3 basics. Every time we've had a huge shift in our society, middle of the 19th century after the cholera epidemics, after the Second World War with the Attlee government, moments where everything has been shifting, the Industrial Revolution, the end of the wartime period, or the 2 wars, and now with technological change and such huge change in our society, and the great crisis of COVID, and the change in our outlook around the world with leaving the European Union, 3 things have been engaged with by government: housing, education, health. And we don't have that vision for housing that you just all could instantly name for health. So that's the first point. We need to know where we're going. Second point, you're quite right. It's got to be cross-party. So 20 years, there will be different parties in office. And third point is that it is such a huge problem. We've got to change the expectations. If you're ever representing a developer, part of presumably what you try and do is negotiate down the level of affordable housing that is going to be compulsory. And maybe you're so much nicer than that. I must remember, if I'm ever developing, which one of you to go to. Yeah. And and one of the things that is a reasonable thing there is when someone of good ethical basis decides to develop some land they got planning permission because their great-grandfather bought a field a couple of miles from a town, which is now a big town, and suddenly someone wants to build on it. And they're going for planning permission. They have reasonable expectations, and the courts say the reasonable expectations are reasonable. So we've got to change the expectations. You can't do that overnight. It wouldn't be just, it wouldn't be fair, but you can raise the potential level of affordable or social housing steadily over a lengthy period like that. And that's a reasonable thing to do.
I completely agree.
Justin, do you think that there's the scope for the Church of England to partner with other significant denominations of Christianity and indeed other significant religions in the UK to maximise the effectiveness of religious leadership generally in addressing the housing crisis?
I don't just think there's scope for it. I think it's essential, which in some cases, looking at our history, has not always been what we did. I mean, we either sent them to prison or burnt them at the stake. There's an old story about a vicar seeing his bishop after the vicar had been in his post in his town parish for a year or so, and the bishop says, "So, how's it going?" He said, "It's going very well. Thank you, Bishop." And the bishop says, "Do you ever pray with your other Christian colleagues in other churches?" And he says, "Well, they pray in their ways and I pray in God's." And that's typically been the way that, historically we behaved, if one's really honest. So what's happened in the last 25, 30 years is the ecumenism, our partnership with other churches, has absolutely changed. I mean, I will routinely go and see the Pope now. Now, when Michael Ramsey went in 1966, it was top of the news. Nowadays, nobody's remotely interested. Praise God for that. I am so pleased, because that shows it's routine. So we've got the relationships. People like the Methodists have quite a lot of land. Many other churches have land. Of course, we'll partner with them. We'll partner with anyone, and certainly with other faith leaders. I mean, the Chief Rabbi and I get on very well. We work extremely closely with the other major faith traditions in this country, the Hindus, the Sikhs, and the Muslims in particular. If we don't partner, it won't work. What was it Benjamin Franklin said to the 13 colonies in the American Revolution? We must hang together, or we will most assuredly hang separately.
Couldn't agree more.
Moving on, my next question is about the consequences. Where would you like these recommendations to lead to? Obviously, there's a plan over 20 years, but more specifically in the short term, the report is packed full of recommendations. What do you think in terms of the implementation of those recommendations? What are your ambitions in the sort of next 5 to 10 years?
Well, there are some really quick wins. What we would love to see is one quick step from the government, which is to change the way that the benefit system works, to ensure that people are, and to change some rules about tenancy, to ensure that people are more secure in their tenancies. It's less easy to throw them out. That landlords have a proper, not an unjust, but a proper obligation to their tenants, and the benefits for housing meet the need for housing. And those three things, you could do those in 6 months easily, government could, and it would make a really big difference. We, at the same time, have already appointed both a senior bishop, the incoming Bishop of Chelmsford, Bishop Guli Francis Decani. She is going to take over from the Bishop of Manchester, leading on housing. He will go on working on it. He's a great expert on housing. And there will be bishops around the country who lead on housing and encourage dioceses to make land available. That's two things. We've already started on that. Third thing, we're appointing someone who's been working with the Duchy of Cornwall. They've been seconded to us for 3 years part-time to lead an executive team that will advise on how you can do what the report says you should do, will advise dioceses and parishes and the church generally. Fourthly, we need to change our aims in certain places so that we don't always go for best value when we sell property. And we need to be willing to undertake development ourselves rather than simply selling to a developer. Now, we can do all that very quickly within 12 to 18 months, which, given we've had some of this land for over 1,000 years, is quite quick in the context of things. And I would hope in 5 years that around at least half our dioceses are actively involved in developing land, and that there is a significant amount of church commissioners' land being used for affordable housing. It doesn't mean getting no return, as you know. It just means sacrificing a bit of return, and in building communities. And as a result, we've got partnerships with local government and with central government that enable significant amounts of housing to be built on an affordable and community basis. And in 10 years, that has become the habit and expectation across the development and building industry.
Justin, I was going to just ask whether if you could choose one significant change in the law that could lead to a permanent improvement, what would it be? And I was wondering whether it might be allowing the church commissioners to sell at a threshold below best consideration.
Yes, that would probably be the single most important one. I think a change in the law that applied to charities generally, to say that social purpose of the charity is a higher priority than best value, while remaining prudent and all the good things. I mean, the church commissioners are an extraordinarily effective ethical investor in equities. In equities, they're a small player by global standards. They have about, 6-7 billion. But they've leveraged that with partnerships so that they are one of the key voices in two partnerships, one of $13 trillion and one of $33 trillion. Now, whoever you go and see, $13 trillion, even Tesla or Amazon, that's a reasonable amount of money. And what they're working on with that is extremely strongly with the extractive industries and to improve their performance, mining industries, but also increasingly broadly across the equity sector on anti-slavery and all this kind of thing. They're incredibly good at it. A guy called Adam Matthews leads on it, just superb. And we just need to be able to do the same on land. Just to put the social purpose right up front. And in that way, we keep our soul, and we also have a very reasonable return.
Can I just ask Justin, one of the things that we notice obviously in all our housing inquiries is the fundamental problem is often the local population and how they receive housing developments. I mean, without lecturing people too much, but what's your message to people about how they should perceive change, development, housing schemes? How can we change the mindset, which is quite common, that people see these kind of developments as a threat? That's the kind of default position.
First of all, we have to listen to communities. You can't just go in there and tell people and do things to people. You've got to do it with them. I mean, that's how we've worked forever, since long before this was a country. And I think, therefore, anyone can understand people's anxiety about this sort of thing. I was vicar in a small rural town in mid-Warwickshire, where until, I went into the parish in 1995, until the 1980s, the population was about 3,000 or 4,000. Then there was a big road running around the side of it. People started building the other side of the road. When I arrived, it was about 8,000. Now, that has an enormous effect on a community. That really, you understand why people are anxious about that. Schools. So one of the ways you've got to do it is you've got to ensure that when you're doing a development, that the social structure of the place is cared for. If you're not going to need another school, you have another school. Surgeries, shopping, all the things that you don't simply overwhelm the local society. Secondly, the long-term interest of these communities is that development that is beautiful, the 5 S's, goes ahead, because affordable development means young families. If there's a school in your town and your village, it means the school will get new kids coming in. It means new life. It means the community will keep going. Your shops will stay open. Your post office will stay open. The economy will continue to function. And we saw that when I was in that place. I mean, as we managed to draw the community in from both sides of the bypass, as they said, we saw a lot more people coming to the church, for example, and we saw growth in all kinds of ways. And the pubs were open, 9 pubs, not that I was counting, of course. And it's a really young, affordable housing means healthy communities.
Justin, my next question is really on a similar theme to Sasha's, and again, born out of experience of housing schemes very often being delayed or stopped because of local politics, which in turn tends to be driven by local objections, often led by parish councils. So very often out of the best of intentions, but due to fears, etc., along the lines you described. And I was struck by chapter 7 of the report, which, as you know, sets out recommendations for individuals to take a more selfless, indeed more Christian approach to new housing proposals, to think about what it means for those who may benefit from them. And I just wondered, recognising that it's not the church's role to sort of instruct or tell people, force people to do certain things, but is there anything more proactive that the church can do, particularly in relation to leveraging the network this incredible network that you have, reaching the parts that others can't reach, to try and persuade, for example, those involved in the leadership of parish councils just to think about the other side of the coin?
Well, I think from my own experience and from what I see right across the diocese which I serve, which is Canterbury Diocese, obviously, local clergy are doing that very well by example and by persuasion, by personality, and also surprising that it may seem, quite often by sort of sermons and teaching. The Good Samaritan, that's the command to love your neighbor as yourself. These are fundamentals which resonate even with those of no faith. I mean, they go very deeply in our society. And I think that, we've had, the last year has been a year of grief and lament for unspeakable numbers of people. But there have been some extraordinary golden strands that have wound through the darkness. And one of them is the way communities have come together and realized what it means to care for your neighbor. I talked to my mother last week that she's in her early 90s, she's on her own. And she says, the people around, she's lived there for where she lives for half a century. The people, it's in central London, the people around the square, they all know her. When she goes out, everyone greets her. People come and knock on the door and say, can I walk the dog? Someone checks on her a couple of times a day, apart from her carer. And those are things that just didn't used to happen. And it's just a fairly typical thing. So I think the thing I like about these 5 values is that they resonate, and they're not only theologically very solid, and that's set out in the report, but they resonate with something deep within our society that people say, yeah, that sounds right. That sounds good to me. Even those of no faith at all, they like the sound of that because it goes deep within our culture.
Justine, it's been a real, genuine privilege to listen to all those questions relating to planning and the fantastic paper that's been produced by the Church of England this week. But I've got a final question, and obviously, as a final question with 5 lawyers, I can't fail to take this as an opportunity. When you get a guest, very often you undertake research and you go down rabbit holes. And the more I read in terms of things you said, the more I hope you're somewhat of a kindred spirit to some of us that'll be on the call. Back in 2013, you said, justice of the powerful is not justice at all, and judges should decide issues based on truth and the common good, rather than class and money. So my question, just a small issue at the very end of our conversation, is how important do you perceive the rule of law in general terms is, particularly to those who are at the bottom of society?
Well, actually, I'll answer it seriously. I mean, it's something I remember when I was reading law at Cambridge, HLA Hart, Law, Liberty and Morality. Still get it on my shelf just up here. I still look at it from time to time. The rule of law, there are about 80 million Anglicans around the world. The Church of England's about 2% of them. Your average Anglican is a woman in sub-Saharan Africa in her 30s on less than $4 a day with a 50-50 chance of being in a place of persecution or conflict. And so I've spent much of the last 20 years in mediation, conflict mediation in places like Nigeria, in South Sudan, Kenya, and war zones elsewhere in the Middle East, with people who are in countries where the rule of law is only the rule of the gun. I remember on one wonderful occasion in Palestine, I was stopped at a roadblock and a rather drunk soldier, police officer with an AK-47 shoved the barrel into my face and was asking for all kinds of questions, and my mobile phone went off. This was a long time before I was Archbishop. And I sort of smiled politely, as one does in the circumstances, and picked it up, said, do you mind? So I said, hello. And at the time, I was living in Warwickshire, and this voice said, Mr. Welby, it's Southern Windows. Would it be convenient for us to come and do your windows this afternoon? I said, well, could I ring you back? I'm just being held at gunpoint in a checkpoint in the Middle East. Oh, yes, that's quite convenient, sir. Now, but the point about that is in most of the countries where Anglicans live and where my wife and I go, and she goes and works with women leaders to renew in them their capacity for mediation, because you never make peace without the women being involved in these terrible situations. And when you go somewhere where you've, as I remember vividly doing with her, we went to a town where there were 3,000 unburied bodies, and a militia had swept through it. And I consecrated a mass grave into which the bodies of all the clergy of townspeople were just piled, women, children. And that had been done by a senior member of the government of that country, by their militia. If the choice is, do we want the rule of law or that? I don't have to think for very long. The opposite of the rule of law is Hobbes. Life which is nasty, brutish, and short. And at the risk of saying nice things about lawyers, what you do, even when it comes to planning, you look in towns all over the place and you look at some terrible thing where they've leveled a bunch of shops that were the only income source for some really poor people. They never had to ask for planning permission. They just had to get it done. And when you talk about parish councils, in my parish, I used to go to the town council. It's a small town. And the whole thing was, has councillor so-and-so noticed that the third street light down such and such a street is no longer working and one of the paving stones is sticking up? If you don't have that kind of system, you actually find you don't have anything at all. So to me, it is absolutely indispensable. But of course, I will finish by saying it's far too expensive.
Very difficult to argue with that. Justin, thank you so much. It's been an absolute privilege. And of all the answers I expected to that question, that's probably the most powerful I could have even dreamed of. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We are so grateful to you. I can't say how much. You're absolutely right. Sometimes we do talk down the affordable housing in new developments, but I have to say, amongst all of us, sometimes we talk it up as well. And
I'm sure you do.
And we try to deliver more than is required sometimes. But we are so grateful to you, so grateful for this fabulous report. The moral authority of the church will be a voice to be listened to when so often this is not listened to. And it is a truly exceptional piece of work.